Now we move to our next two speakers coming from Norway. The first one is Kjell Inge Bjerge, who is a director for the Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies, a research institution under the Norwegian Armed Forces. He is a professor there and director. I give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Minister, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to come to beautiful Iceland and share some reflections on security and defense from Norway. It is an honor to be here with Ættingjar okkar á Íslandi. I'm trying. First, a disclaimer. I do not represent Norwegian authorities like the next speaker, Hanne Blomberg, from the Norwegian Security Police Service. I'm an historian and director of the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies at the Norwegian Defense University College. That is an independent research institution operating under the law of higher education that protects the freedom of academic institutions in Norway. At the same time, my institute is part of the defense sector and do some classified research, and we do give policy briefs to the authorities, mostly on China, Russia, NATO, transatlantic relations, and Norwegian security policy, including total defense, which I think is a key word for this seminar. We are also responsible for the National Higher Executive Course in Norway, a course both our distinguished ambassador and the eminent next speaker knows very well. The senior course is unique in a Nordic context. It brings together central stakeholders of the Norwegian total defense so that they can learn to know each other and to develop knowledge and the concept of total defense together. Total defense is also an important aspect of the three open threat and risk assessments addressed at this seminar, which I will come back to. I will give some outside-in and critical perspectives on the Norwegian way of dealing with the very dangerous and complex security situation we are facing, a situation that is thoroughly described in the three assessments. Russia is the defining threat for Norway, and the wide spectrum of hybrid means they are using in the ongoing war against the West is a huge challenge for the Norwegian system of governance. The same is to be said about the threats from China, Iran, and non-state terrorist actors and organizations, but for now and the foreseeable future, Russia overshadows most other threats. At the heart of how Norway tries to cope with this situation is the Norwegian system of governance. It might sound a bit boring, but the system in itself is extremely important given the hybrid threats, and this leads me back to the title of my introduction, Coordinated Open Threat and Risk Assessments. Why, how, and what? I will start with the what and how, and at the end of my introduction, come back to the why from a security policy and military perspective. I believe the next speaker, Hanne, will address domestic threats, so I leave that for her. Okay, the what and how. Let's see if this works. The what and how. Norway has three security and intelligence services. First, the National Security Authority. That is a preventive authority responsible for securing critical infrastructure and governmental institutions in Norway. Back in 2003, the Security Authority was the first one out with an annual open risk assessment, RISK 2003. The point was to identify and prioritize between potential security risks and to share this with the public in order to engage the public, increase public risk awareness, and to get help from the public to prevent and mitigate risks. Second, the next year, in 2004, the Police Security Service followed on and published for the first time the first annual Open National Threat Assessment, the NTA 2004. The police identified domestic threats. No surprise, a few years after 9/11, international terrorism was high on the agenda. As for the Security Authority, the aim was to increase public awareness and to get help from the public to detect suspicious activity and incidents. Number 3 is the Military Intelligence Service. This one, the biggest and most dominant one, was more reluctant to share its threat assessments with the public, mostly because of their very close cooperation with foreign intelligence services. However, under General Kjell Granhagen, then head of military intelligence, in 2011 they concluded that the gains from open threat assessments were bigger than the potential downsides. They also noted that the experiences with open assessments were good, and a culture of more openness had developed among the secret services in Norway. Hence, in 2011, the first open annual focus report was published by the Intelligence Service. The argument was exactly the same as for the Security Authority and the Police Security Service. The public awareness when it came to external threats against Norway had to be better, and by sharing the military threat assessments, the public was invited to report suspicious activity and incidents. During the Cold War, such public awareness and engagement had been a crucial part of the total defense concept in Norway and of the national readiness. Let me give you an example. The Norwegian coastline is the second longest in the world. Of course, the population along the coast is one of the best sensors for detecting suspicious naval activity 24/7, in particular submarine activity. In the 1970s, for instance, observations from the coastal population resulted in detection and hunt for several hostile submarines deep inside the Norwegian fjords. All in all, to sum it up, the main purposes of all 3 risk and threat assessments were increased public awareness, get assistance from the public, and to strengthen total defense and resilience. However, when the Intelligence Service published its first open assessment in 2011, and all 3 were out in the open, there was no coordination between them. They were developed and published separately, 2 by the Minister of Defense, i.e. the risk and the intelligence assessments, and the national threat assessments from the police by the Minister of Defense, separated. To put it simple, this fragmentation was inadequate given the risk and threat situation that emerged around the millennium. Over the past 20 years or so, the security situation and threat landscape for Norway and all the Nordic countries have changed dramatically. In fact, it has both become increasingly worse, and it has become much more complex and complicated. Everything is connected to everything, to quote the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Harlem Brundtland. Today, we are in a state of global strategic competition, and the most likely risks and threats are non-military. It is a wide range of hostile activities, from economic warfare with tariffs and trade war and so on, hostile investments, just to name a few, to influence campaigns, criminal activity, sabotage, subversion, cyber attacks, and so on and so forth. Both the worsening security situation and the increased complexity explain why Norwegian authorities now coordinate their threat and risk assessments. Behind me, you can see the three agency chiefs present their coordinated assessments earlier this year. The aim is still the same: increased public awareness, engaging the public, and by that strengthen the total defense. The coordinated and joint presentation underlines to the public that this is a dangerous situation we have today, where everything is connected to everything, and that they need to build resilience together. I know this might sound a bit strange, but to witness three agency chiefs giving a joint presentation is quite unique in Norway, and the same is to be said about the other Nordic countries. The governance model in Norway and the other Nordic countries is very sectorized, meaning that each minister of the government is solely responsible for a specific sector and must answer to the Norwegian Parliament for that sector. In other words, military threats are the Minister of Defense responsibility, and civilian threats like terrorism and other forms of crime are the Minister of Justice responsibility, and so on. In peacetime, which is most of the time, the Minister of Justice is responsible for detecting and managing threats and crises in Norway, including major national crises like the horrible act of terror on the 22nd of July 2011, with the bombing of the government building that took 8 lives and the following massacre on 69 young people outside of Oslo. Over time, the sectorized governance model has led to a stovepiping of responsibilities in Norway. When it comes to security and defense, this worked quite well during the Cold War and in the 1990s, because the security threats that the Norwegian government had to deal with back then were clearly defined as either military or civilian, and threat number one was the military one from the Soviet bloc. However, as mentioned, and as we all know, this has changed during the last 20 years, and today we are in a situation with very few clear-cut distinctions between different kinds of threats, as it is described in the three risk and threat assessments. Are the threats military or civilian? Are they kinetic or non-kinetic? Are they coming from state actors or from non-state actors? Are they coming from outside of Norway or from the inside? Are they local or regional threats, national threats? And how to attribute them? I might be stating the obvious here, but a stovepiped public management is clearly not fit for dealing with this complex picture. Hence, the coordination of assessments is a big step in the right direction. Coordination builds common ground for strengthening national security. When all the security agencies agree on risks and threats, it is much easier for the Prime Minister and the government to make national priorities. And today, ladies and gentlemen, on the 8th of May, the Norwegian Liberation Day, Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre is presenting the first ever national security strategy of Norway. This strategy builds on the coordinated assessments and could not have been developed without them. The idea is that the national security strategy is a first step and that it will give guidance for plans and strategies to come in all sectors relating to national security. This is a huge step for Norway towards a more comprehensive national approach, and as you recognize, it's quite similar to the American hierarchy of documents with the American national strategy on top, and where all other plans and strategies are expected to be linked to the top strategy. The new Norwegian strategy presented today emphasizes the concept of total defense, strengthened armed forces within the framework of NATO, and closer ties to what we call close allies. That is the Nordic countries, of course, including Iceland. It is Poland, it is France, it is Germany, and the UK, and the United States of America. Allied deterrence is described in the new strategy as a combination of conventional and nuclear capabilities. The strategy also includes a strong economy as a vital security asset, together with securing energy supplies and so on. As I mentioned in the beginning, the most dreaded and deadly threat against Norway and the other Nordic countries is today military, and it comes from Russia. Norway is therefore planning to use 1,635 billion kroner, probably more, on defense over the next 12 years. On this, I have three concerns. First, given the threat assessments emphasizing hybrid threats, the question can be asked, are huge military investments without similar investments in civilian preparedness sufficient? Should perhaps some of the defense billions have been spent on a civilian preparedness in parallel? Second, the most urgent danger right now, and that is also addressed in the new security strategy. The most urgent danger right now is Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. A Russian victory will have dramatic consequences for Europe's security in both the short and the long term. Now, Russia is weakened economically and militarily. However, if they win the war one way or another, in a short time, they will be back demographically, economically, and militarily. Over the past couple of years, they have transformed their entire economy and production lines into a war machinery. In 5 to 10 years, they will be a significant threat to the whole of Europe if they win the Ukraine war. So, it is a no-brainer that the Europeans should support, assist, and help Ukraine as much as it can. And that is, to be honest, far more than we have done until now. For Norway, more of the defense billions could perhaps be given to Ukraine instead of buying more tanks for Norway. Third, a challenge also mentioned in the new security strategy is the uncertain transatlantic relationship and the implications for NATO. No doubt, the community of shared values across the Atlantic is challenged today. Do we still have a common Euro-Atlantic set of liberal democratic values? Question mark. The mere fact that this question can be asked should cause big concerns. NATO is based on shared values. Without common basic values, the security guarantee of the alliance is not credible. However, and this is my very important last point, for Norway, Iceland, Greenland, and the UK, Much of the American security guarantee is based on American self-interest. As long as the Americans are threatened by strategic Russian submarines from the Kola Peninsula, they need to keep us as close allies and to defend our territories. This is very simple. Just look at the map. Because of the war in Ukraine, Russia is severely weakened on the land and on the air side. And if you count, for instance, the number of F-35s in Northern Europe, you come to 434. That is an overwhelming force. The Russians, they have no chance against this firepower. And you can also see with Finland and Sweden in NATO, the supply and logistical lines, the network in the Nordic countries, is substantial. So we have a conventional, we are stronger than the Russians on land and air. The remaining military threat, and this threat is not influenced by the war in Ukraine, and that is the naval threat from Russia. You can see the military installations in the Arctic. All of them are intact, and they have massive strategic capability placed in the Arctic. This threat remains, and it is not influenced by the war in Ukraine. It is a threat to us, and it is a big threat to the US, and that is very important. Because if you see the scenarios we are working on, the strategic capabilities of the Russians located at the Kola Peninsula need to get into the open oceans in case of crisis and war. And as you know, of course, they need to pass through the Beer Gap and the Guyuk Gap to get into the oceans and become invincible. So the strategic importance of this area here and this area here is increasingly important today, which means that no matter what happens in Ukraine, I think, this threat will remain, and the Americans will be very aware of it, and they will need to get it mitigated. Just a little map of the seabed to illustrate my point further at the end. So by that, ladies and gentlemen, that was my presentation. I think I should leave the floor right away to Hanne. Thank you.